The Crusader army besieged Antioch on its way to Jerusalem. They successfully repelled two separate relief forces from Damascus and Aleppo while maintaining the siege for months. Starvation, cold, desertion, and disease tested the expedition's religious convictions. But in this episode, they will face their most difficult and bloody trial yet. The year was 1098, and the Latins were about to change history in more ways than one. However, it's worth considering an alternate history. There was something that could have easily prevented this Crusader chaos and many other historic troubles. Against all odds, Vermont and his 700 men managed to repel a force of 10,000 with a combination of shock tactics, bravery, and sheer audacity, saving their campaign and providing essential food and supplies. Back at the camp, the Crusaders withstood another foul attempt from the garrison. As winter subsided, the return of the Norman knights lifted the spirits of the besiegers, reinforcing their belief that God was on their side. This triumphal march from the Battle of the Iron Bridge was also witnessed by an unlikely emissary at the camp. Representatives of the Fatimid Caliphate arrived on the day of the battle, responding to letters the Crusaders had written earlier at Alexios's suggestion, outlining the political disarray in the Muslim world. Despite the religious fervor of the Crusaders, the guests were shown great hospitality and received gifts from the camp. Peter the Hermit was chosen to negotiate, but it soon became clear that the Egyptians viewed this army as a Byzantine force. The emissaries knew that those who took the cross and answered Alexios's call were generously compensated and had sworn to return any former Byzantine city to him. Over half of the initial force had already lost their lives on this journey, and more than 100 strategic locations had been handed over to the Romans, or were temporarily held by Baldwin, who had not yet officially established his county of Edessa. Shipments from the empire continued to be the crucial lifeline that supported the crusade. However, with Alexios gone, there was no Byzantine representative to negotiate with the Fatimids, making it unlikely they would engage with these mercenaries. The envoys remained in the camp for over a month before returning to Cairo with a few Franks. Both sides agreed to neutrality, preventing a potential blockade from the only powerful Muslim navy in the region. As March approached, it marked the end of the hardest phase of the campaign. Many had been slain, others died from cold and disease. The poor succumbed to hunger, and those who could not endure the horrors of siege warfare deserted, while women were exiled. Yet those who remained were some of the most hardened, committed, and disciplined warriors in history. Reflecting on this period, Anselm of Ribamont, a knight who survived the Antiochian winter, wrote, "Growing stronger and stronger, therefore, from that day our men took counsel with renewed courage." On March 4th, an English fleet arrived at St. Simeon carrying supplies, tools, and craftsmen, resources that would not only extend, but potentially end the siege. Up until then, the garrison had been in constant contact with the outside world, trading information and resources through its southern gates. To secure the heavy supplies from the relatively distant port, the two most powerful princes, Vermont and Ribamont, were chosen to escort the convoy, accompanied by 60 knights and 500 infantry. Once again, the ever-watchful citadels observed these movements, and Yekasian had his mounted archers harass the Crusader camp while laying an ambush near the bridge gate. The return journey from the port took 3 days, and once the convoy was spotted, the trap was sprung. On March 7th, the Seljuks charged at a vulnerable gap in the infantry line. To quote the chronicler, "The Turks began to gnash their teeth and chatter and howl with very loud cries, wheeling around our men, throwing darts and loosing arrows, wounding and slaughtering them most brutally. Their fierce attack caused panic among the Crusaders, who began to flee over the nearest mountain or wherever they could find a path. Those who escaped quickly lived, while those who could not were killed. The majority of the infantry was quickly broken, but only 2 knights were lost, highlighting the lack of cohesion in the Crusader ranks. Seizing the rear guard, Vermont rushed in with reinforcements, while Godfrey of Bouillon rallied his troops from the camp and joined the fray. An intense battle ensued before the walls of Antioch, escalating as Yekasian poured in more troops from the garrison. After months of standoffs and harassment, the two sides finally clashed in open field. The garrison was pushed back towards the bridge gate as panic overwhelmed the Muslim forces. The chronicler noted, "Those who did not succeed in crossing the bridge alive because of the great press of men and horses suffered their everlasting death with the devil and his imp." The river ran red with the blood of Turks as the Crusaders drove them into the water, striking down any who attempted to climb the pillars of the bridge or swim to safety. Yekasian had played his hand, relying on intelligence, mobility, and the element of surprise. Had his ambush succeeded, the Crusaders would have lost their leaders, precious supplies, and the initiative gained from recent victories. Eyewitness accounts later reported that both sides lost around 1,500 men, significantly reducing the enemy garrison's strength. The Christian clergy held services to commemorate the fallen, while the survivors displayed their newly acquired Arabian horses and silk clothing. At dawn, the Muslims from Antioch briefly left the city to bury their dead in a nearby abandoned mosque, alongside cloaks, coins, bows, and arrows. Upon hearing this, the Crusaders rushed to the mosque, ordering the bodies to be dug up and the tombs destroyed. They threw the corpses into a pit, severed their heads, and brought them to their tent for account, except for those loaded onto 4 horses belonging to the ambassadors of the Emir of Cairo. On March 10th, work began on a new fort built atop the abandoned mosque, renamed La Malmarie, or Blessed Mary. While not a fortress, it provided cover against arrow fire and choked the crucial bridge gate under Raymond's command. By the end of the month, the garrison launched a surprise attack on the fort, testing its strength and nearly succeeding. However, heavy rain slowed them long enough for reinforcements to arrive and push them back, another divine sign that lifted the spirits of one side and tested the resolve of the other. In April, the noose tightened after Tancred was appointed and paid to secure an abandoned monastery near the St. George Gate. Within days, his party captured a Syrian and Armenian trade caravan, seizing grain, wine, and oil, which now fed the Crusaders instead of the city. While not completely encircled, the city received limited supplies from the hard-to-reach Iron Gate as tensions grew. Muslim sallies ceased, allowing foraging to continue, while shipments from the empire became more frequent. Suddenly, the Crusaders received an influx of horses and weapons from Baldwin of Boulogne, the new ruler of Edessa. During this time, emissaries were sent to Tripoli, revealing a fragmented Islamic world. Antioch's neighbors were well aware of the month-long struggle, with many unconcerned and even treating the Latins with hospitality as they traveled freely through the Levant. The only significant event in April and May involved the captive crusader René Pochet. Yekasian sought to ransom him and threatened to burn alive all remaining captives unless Pochet renounced Christianity. The screams echoed in the city and Crusader camp, signaling to both sides that there could be no middle ground. Despite this, around the end of May, the Crusaders received a message from the garrison indicating their readiness to surrender. A few representatives, including the Constable of France, Wello, were sent into the city, only to be killed once inside. Whether this was a trap or a thwarted plot, it revealed a potential key to the city, one that Vermont had been working on for months. In April, Vermont's men made contact with Ferrut, a Christian who had converted to Islam and was responsible for one of the southeastern towers on the mountain, known as the Tower of the Two Sisters. His proximity to Tancred's position, ability to speak Greek, and distance from the rest of the Crusaders allowed him to exchange intelligence via selectively permitted Armenian merchant caravans. Without revealing his agent to the rest of the Crusaders, Vermont summoned a council and delivered a speech. "Most gallant knights, you see that we are all, both great and small, in dire poverty and misery, and we do not know from whence better fortune will come to us. If, therefore, you think it is a good and proper plan, let one of us set himself above the others, on the condition that if he can capture the city or engineer its downfall by any means, he will agree to give it to him. Vermont was a legend within the camp, but the other leaders knew of his ambition and refused his offer. They believed there was no need to rush. The garrison's morale was failing, and the Crusaders were finally well supplied and fed. From their perspective, it was only a matter of time before they were victorious. However, a storm had been brewing in the east for several months as an ambitious leader rallied the Muslim world and headed straight for Antioch. Yakisian's youngest son, Muhammad, had reached Baghdad and convinced the caliph to send a relief force. The man chosen to lead this army was Kerbogha, the Beg of Mosul, a soldier Turk who had spent a decade chasing down enemies and changing allegiances before securing Harran, Nisibis, and Mosul in the name of the caliph in 1096. The situation in Antioch presented him with an opportunity to prove himself and carve out a position in the crumbling Seljuk world. After 6 months of careful planning, he created a coalition with forces from Damascus, Harran, Horn, Mardin, Samosata, and Sinjar. The previous relief forces numbered just over 10,000 men, but this coalition boasted between 35,000 and 45,000 highly motivated troops. As the coalition made its way westward, rumors began to spread. Kerbogha first besieged Edessa for 3 weeks without progress before moving on to Antioch. The Crusaders sent out scouting parties to investigate, and according to the chronicler, they saw the Muslim army swarming everywhere, from the mountains and different roads, like the fans of the sea, unable to count the infinite thousands. When the scouts returned on May 28th, reporting that the enemy was just days away, the Crusaders realized their position was untenable. In this dire moment, Vermont spoke to the council again. All but Raymond agreed, adding the stipulation that if Vermont captured the city, it would be granted to him, but only if Antioch was returned to the emperor, if Alexios came to their aid, as their honor was at stake. The next few days were tense, as the Crusaders sensed something was amiss when the acting chairman of the council, Stéphane Augois, deserted under the pretext of being ill. On the evening of June 3rd, 700 Crusaders departed from the camp to fool the defenders of the citadel. Around 3 a.m., the men returned to the slopes above the St. George Gate. A sizable contingent was under the command of Godfrey and Robert of Flanders, while the rest followed Vermont. Everyone held their breath as they whistled at the Tower of Two Sisters, watching Ferrut throw down a thick rope to which they attached a ladder. Uncertain of what awaited them, the Crusaders hesitated. Would they be climbing to their deaths, like the French constable? Would they end up in flames, like the prisoners? Or would they be the ones to finally break the long siege? Encouraged by Vermont, they began to climb. Burdened by heavy equipment and rushing to the top, a few fell, killing some and injuring others. Despite the risks, 60 men, including Vermont, reached the top of the tower and stealthily informed the guards in the nearby 3 towers, as well as Ferrut's brother by mistake. A postern gate was opened, and the remaining 600 Crusaders rushed in. Vermont sounded his bugle. While Godfrey and Robert rushed toward the citadel, a small band of men created as much noise as possible as they penetrated the city. Within minutes, chaos erupted as the besiegers, who had threatened the city for months, were now finally inside. The Normans struck at anything that moved in the darkness. As fear spread, there was little resistance, and many fled for their lives. Dawn broke, revealing the blood-red banner of Vermont atop an archway. The city had fallen to fewer than 1,000 men, and the terrified Christian populace opened the main gates, begging the Crusaders to spare their lives. None were spared that day. Christians, Muslims, men, women, children, and elders alike. The chronicler wrote, "All the streets of the city on every side were full of corpses, so that no one could endure to be there because of the stench, nor could anyone walk along the narrow paths of the city, except over the corpses of the dead." The attack on the citadel failed, leaving an isolated pocket of defenders with access to the iron gates. As for Yakisian, he managed to avoid the slaughter and escape the city, only to be caught by local Armenians, who delivered his head to the Crusaders for a price. However, the Latins soon discovered that the horses in the garrison were unsuited for their style of warfare, and supplies were dwindling. On June 5th, 1098, they looked over the ramparts and saw the army of Kerbogha. Once again, utter ruin was avoided, but they now faced another impossible challenge. A knight named Grigero von Weil charged at the host with 15 of his men, only to be lured by a feigned retreat and wiped out. The besiegers became the besieged, desperately trying to fortify the city while Kerbogha occupied the only fortification the Crusaders had not abandoned, La Malmarie. Wave after wave of attacks were repelled, but it was too much for the makeshift fort, which was abandoned and destroyed a few days later. Now both sides focused on the citadel. Kerbogha replaced Yakisian's son with one of his own men, revealing his intentions regarding Antioch and preparing his forces to trickle into the city via the Iron Gate, while the Crusaders camped against it, knowing they would never be secure if it remained in enemy hands. Outnumbered 2-1, the Latins launched another audacious attack, charging at the Muslims from the southern postern gate and catching them by surprise. Although initially successful, the attack resulted in heavy casualties, as the Crusaders overstayed their welcome looting the Muslim camp or were trampled on their way back to the tiny gate. Rather than risking a prolonged siege while feeding 40,000 men, Kerbogha launched an offensive along the steep slope of the mountain. His troops poured out of the citadel into Antioch through a single jagged path, coordinating their assault with another attack along the south wall, forcing the Crusaders to fight on two fronts. For 2 days, the assaults raged from dawn to dusk. A Crusader who lived through this period remarked, "A man with food has no time to eat, and a man with water no time to drink." Endless waves of attackers were cut down, only for more to appear. The cold winter seemed like a distant memory as men collapsed from exhaustion under the summer heat. Many, including well-known knights, began to desert by throwing ropes over the walls, earning the nickname rope dancers. Most of them were rounded up and slain by the soldiers. To prevent the total collapse of the garrison, the leaders swore an oath not to abandon the city and sealed the gates. The unrelenting assault, difficult conditions, and rising death toll were more severe than anything the Crusaders had faced before. At one point, Vermont found himself surrounded by enemies, but was narrowly saved by Ribera of Flanders and Ribera of Normandy. Elsewhere, an Italian knight known as Mad Hugh defended his position single-handedly, breaking 3 spears in the process. 4 days into the onslaught, Vermont ordered several buildings burned after discovering some men hiding there. As expected, the fire got out of hand and consumed a large part of the city. On the night of June 13th to 14th, as the Crusaders neared collapse, a comet appeared in the dark sky, rallying the soldiers one last time. This glimpse of hope gave them the strength to endure the night. The comet, alongside the fires burning within the city, demoralized the Muslim soldiers, who pulled back after one of the bloodiest battles of medieval warfare. Kerbogha suffered terrible losses, but so did the Crusaders. The Muslim army spread out, completely surrounding the city, now content to wait and watch the Latins die from starvation atop the citadel. Desperate and with no way out, Godfrey lost 200 men in an attempt to raise the Muslim camp outside St. Paul's Gate. Meanwhile, Tancred conducted a stealth mission with 10 men and returned with 6 soldier captives, while Henri of Aix repelled a contingent trying to climb the walls with ladders, sacrificing 2 relatives in the process. Despite these brave attempts, the situation seemed hopeless as the week dragged on. To stave off hunger, the Crusaders boiled the skins of horses, camels, donkeys, and wild plants as their numbers continued to dwindle. Then, on June 10th, a peasant from Provence named Peter Barcolomain confessed to having visions revealing that the spear that pierced Jesus during his crucifixion was buried under the Basilica of St. Peter. Many, including Bishop Adhemar, were skeptical since they had seen the Holy Lance in the vault of Constantinople during their journey. However, others, like Remor, believed Peter and commissioned 12 men to carry out the excavation. After digging for an entire day without success, Peter jumped into the hole barefoot and began to pray. Suddenly, a small shard of metal was found, and the entire host rejoiced. It is difficult to overstate the impact this relic had on the army, and even modern scholars agree it significantly boosted Crusader morale. Later that year, the Latins wrote to the Pope, stating, "We were so comforted and strengthened by the lance's discovery, and by so many other divine revelations, that some of us who had been discouraged and fearful beforehand became courageous and resolute to fight, encouraging each other." The next 2 weeks passed uneventfully, as the starving but uplifted Crusaders hoped for reinforcements. Peter the Hermit was sent to negotiate with Kerbogha, proposing a duel to prevent mass casualties. The Atabegs simply laughed, demanding that they surrender and convert to Islam if they wished to live. Trapped, the Latins decided to pursue an aggressive and bold strategy. They would forfeit their defensive position and attack the enemy head-on. Bohemond was elected commander-in-chief of the entire army. The men fasted for 3 days, shared bread and wine, and marched out of the city at dawn on June 28, 1098. Bohemond divided his nearly entirely infantry-based army of 20,000, including some non-combatants, into 4 equal contingents. The northern French under the 2 Roberts, the Lotharingians and Germans commanded by Godfrey, and the southern French led by Adhemar. Bohemond himself held the reserves, composed of southern Italians, while Raymond, who was ill, stayed behind with 200 men to guard the city against the citadel. Heralds were deployed to ensure cohesion among the 4 groups, and Hugh of Ermendois led a squadron of archers to repel the first line of Muslims. Under the cover of Frankish arrows, each division crossed the river onto the plain and formed ranks. The Muslim force was larger, but spread out to maintain the blockade, and it took time for Kerbogha to learn of the audacious move, as his camp was 5 kilometers to the north. Many years later, the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Azir claimed that during this time, Kerbogha received advice to kill the Crusaders one by one as they emerged from the city. However, he opted to wait until they all came out for a decisive victory. Rather than acting quickly to save the city or using his mounted archers to harass the Crusaders, he ordered a rough, disorganized advance. Meanwhile, the Latins faced an enemy from the south, which rushed in from the back, but the rearguard fought fiercely despite heavy casualties, repelling the attackers and forcing them to flee, disconnected from the rest of the Seljuk host. Numerous tents scattered around the siege line prevented the Seljuks from fully committing to their stealth tactics, especially since their commander was missing. Unlike the Crusaders, the Muslim coalition had only one leader, who struggled to rally his men and charged against the routed troops at night. However, the line of heavy infantry held firm. At close quarters, the Muslims were no match for the Westerners, and it didn't take long for them to turn and flee. One Muslim chronicler reported, "The Franks, though they were in the extremity of weakness, advanced in battle order against the armies of Islam, which were at the height of their strength and numbers, and they broke the ranks of the Muslims and scattered their multitude." The Crusaders overran the Muslim camp, the citadel surrendered, and the Muslim coalition was defeated. Every leader adhered to Bohemond's plan and capitalized on the morale from the Holy Lance as well as their desperation. Though the Crusaders seemed worlds away from home, they once again achieved victory against all odds. The road to Jerusalem was now open. Our series on the First Crusade will continue in the coming weeks, so be sure to subscribe and click the bell button to stay updated. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing, as it helps us immensely.